Teoth with grave nbnoi dung chuin thun, a with circumflexem ton trong emoti, qui, van ban away. Not the first time I understood how deep this went was not in the courtroom, but in my grandfather's study, with the late afternoon sun cutting through the blinds and laying stripes of light across that old oak desk. The house still smelled the same as it did when I was 10 years old, a mix of pipe tobacco that never quite left the walls and lemon oil from the cabinets he polished every Sunday. I pulled the bottom drawer open and felt the familiar resistance in the wood, the way it stuck halfway unless you lifted slightly on the brass handle. That was where he kept everything important. Tax receipts going back decades, original survey maps drawn in blue ink, and the leather folder, dark brown, edges worn soft from years of being handled by careful hands. Inside it was the deed, dated June 17, 1962, transferring 72 acres from a retiring dairy farmer to my grandfather, Samuel Cole. The paper was thick, heavier than modern copies, with a county seal pressed so deep you could feel it with your thumb. Attached behind it was something most developers never expect to see anymore, a family land trust agreement filed in 1974, written in plain language but airtight. The land was to remain agricultural or private unless voluntarily transferred by a direct Cole heir, and any unauthorized development triggered a reversion clause that placed full liability for improvements on the party who initiated construction. I read that sentence 3 times. Full liability for improvements. That meant if someone built without lawful title, every board, every brick, every shingle legally belonged to the landowner. Me. I remember leaning back in the chair and listening to the hum of the old ceiling fan, steady and calm, while outside I could hear distant traffic from the new access road they had carved through what used to be our east fence line. Maggie had told the county the land was dormant. She had filed an adverse possession claim backed by affidavits from a surveyor and a developer eager to break ground. On paper, it looked clean. Notices sent to my Nashville address. Zoning hearings held on weekday mornings. Signatures collected from neighboring parcels that stood to gain property value from a so-called master planned community. But what she did not account for was chain of title. The trust had never been dissolved. It had never been transferred out of the Cole name. And more importantly, the legal description in her filed plat did not match the original metes and bounds from 1962. It was off by nearly 12 feet along the northern boundary. 12 feet might not sound like much, but over 72 acres it shifts everything. That misalignment pushed her entire subdivision footprint squarely onto protected trust land. I took photographs of the original survey, then drove back to the property at dawn the next morning. The grass was damp, cool against my boots, and the new sidewalks were already chalked with hopscotch drawings from families who believed they had found their forever home. I stood at the edge of Lot 37 and measured from the old oak stump that marked the original boundary corner. 12 feet. The stake they placed was wrong. Not by accident. By convenience. I did not call the sheriff. I did not confront Maggie. I went home, scanned every document into digital files, and scheduled a consultation with a title attorney in Franklin who specialized in land disputes older than most of the houses he argued about. I let the landscaping trucks roll in. I let the mailboxes get installed. Because the longer the illusion stood, the stronger the leverage would become when the truth finally entered a courtroom under oath. By the time I sat down in the office of Daniel Mercer, the title attorney in Franklin, the subdivision had sold more than half its inventory. His office smelled like black coffee and old carpet, and every wall was lined with framed plats from disputes that had probably ruined more Thanksgiving dinners than anyone wanted to admit. He adjusted his reading glasses and spread my grandfather's deed beside the developer's recorded plat, running a fingertip slowly along the boundary descriptions while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. They built fast, he said quietly, almost impressed. Fast can look like confidence. I told him I had not objected publicly, that I had attended one county meeting but withdrew my formal protest before the final vote. His eyes lifted. Why? I thought about the rows of framed houses, the moving trucks, the children riding bicycles along fresh concrete. Because unfinished houses are a dispute, I said. Finished houses are leverage. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment, then gave a small nod like he understood exactly what that meant. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched Holloway Meadows fill in. Sod was rolled out in neat green carpets. Sprinkler systems ticked on at 6 in the morning, mist rising in thin silver arcs. Porch lights glowed warm against vinyl siding at dusk. The place looked permanent. Maggie hosted an open house barbecue one Saturday afternoon. White folding tents set up near the model home. A banner stretched between two poles that read "Building Community Together." I parked down the road and stood by the old oak stump that marked the original corner boundary. The music drifted across the lots, country songs about small towns and new beginnings, and I could hear her voice carrying over a microphone, confident and polished. She talked about vision, about revitalizing and used acreage, about raising property values for everyone along Coal Ridge Road. She never said my name. She did not need to. To her, I was a footnote, a technicality that had already been cleared through the appropriate channels. Meanwhile, Daniel filed a quiet request for a complete chain of title audit through the county clerk. We requested every transfer, every lien, every survey amendment tied to those 72 acres dating back to 1962. The clerk's office smelled like toner and old paper, and I stood there listening to the shuffle of documents sliding across metal counters as we uncovered the gap. The trust agreement had been indexed under a secondary reference number that the developer's title search missed. It was not hidden. It was simply inconvenient. That oversight meant the title insurance policies issued to the 96 buyers were built on a flawed assumption of clear ownership. When Daniel explained the implications, his voice remained level, but there was a weight to it. If we move now, he said, it becomes a negotiation. If we wait until the final certificate of occupancy is recorded for every lot, it becomes a reckoning. I drove back past the subdivision that evening, windows down, warm Tennessee air carrying the scent of fresh mulch and grilled hamburgers. I counted the mailboxes, one by one, until I reached 96. Every single one stood on land my grandfather had sworn would stay in the family. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt timing. And timing, when you have the original deed and a trust clause no one bothered to read, is stronger than any ribbon-cutting ceremony. The final certificate of occupancy was recorded on a humid Thursday morning in late June, and I remember the exact sound my phone made when Daniel forwarded the confirmation email, a soft vibration against the wooden table in my kitchen that felt louder than it should have. Outside, cicadas droned in the trees, and down the road in that brand new subdivision, 96 houses officially became move-in ready. Lawns were trimmed to regulation height. Flags hung from porches. Delivery trucks rolled in with sofas and refrigerators and flat-screen televisions. On paper, Holloway Meadows was complete. That was the moment Daniel filed the complaint in Chancery Court. Not against the homeowners. Not even directly against the developer at first. He filed it against the title company that certified the land as free and clear of encumbrances. Breach of duty. Negligent title search. Failure to identify a recorded agricultural trust. The language was clinical, precise, but when you read between the lines it carried weight. I drove past the subdivision that afternoon, windows down, and noticed how permanent everything looked. The street signs were bolted into place. The decorative stone wall at the entrance cast a long shadow across the asphalt. Maggie was standing near the clubhouse talking with a couple who looked newly arrived, her smile bright, her gestures confident. She did not see me. Or maybe she did and assumed I was just another neighbor admiring progress. What she did not know was that a summons was already being prepared with her development company listed as a necessary party to the action. When the paperwork was served the following week, the tone shifted. Daniel called me while I was reviewing spreadsheets at my consulting job in Nashville. They did not expect this angle, he said calmly. The title company immediately initiated its own internal investigation. Within days, letters went out to the developer requesting documentation of the original trust dissolution, which did not exist. The homeowners received formal notices stating that a dispute regarding underlying land ownership had been filed and was under review. I did not celebrate. I did not drive over there to watch reactions. I stayed in my grandfather's study that evening, the leather folder open on the desk, and listened to the distant rumble of traffic from what used to be pasture. My phone buzzed twice with missed calls from an unfamiliar number. Then a third time. I answered on the fourth ring. Maggie's voice was controlled, but there was a tightness under it. She said there must have been a misunderstanding. She said the county approved everything. She said families had already closed and moved in. I let her finish. Then I told her that approvals do not override recorded trust law, and that land cannot be transferred by assumption. There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breathing on the other end of the line. For the first time since she planted that subdivision sign in my north pasture, her certainty sounded thinner. And I knew the real conversation was no longer happening at ribbon cuttings or county meetings. It was moving to a courtroom where paper mattered more than optimism. The county mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning that felt heavier than the weather forecast suggested, and I remember the low rumble of distant thunder even though the sky over Franklin stayed a flat, stubborn gray. Daniel and I arrived early, the hallway outside the conference room smelling faintly of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee from a vending machine down the corridor. When Maggie walked in with the developer's attorney and a representative from the title company, she did not look like the woman who had smiled beneath a banner and promised community vision. She looked tired, composed, but tired. The mediation table was long and polished, papers stacked in neat folders, legal pads aligned like they were part of the architecture. Daniel laid out the original 1962 deed, the 1974 trust agreement, and the certified chain of title audit that traced every transfer without interruption. The title company's attorney flipped through the pages slowly, the sound of paper sliding against paper almost louder than the rain that had finally started tapping against the window. Their internal review had confirmed what we already knew. The trust had never been dissolved. No recorded instrument transferred it out of the Cole family. The developer's survey, the one used to draft 96 lot descriptions, referenced a modern boundary that ignored the meets and bounds language embedded in my grandfather's deed. 12 feet at the north line. A clean-looking error with enormous consequences. The developer's attorney tried to argue good faith reliance on county approval, but good faith does not rewrite recorded law. Maggie finally spoke, her voice steady but stripped of the confidence I had heard at the open house. She said families had invested their savings. She said children were enrolled in local schools. She said undoing the subdivision would be devastating. I listened. I believed her when she said it would hurt people. But harm does not erase ownership. Daniel outlined the reversion clause in plain terms. Any unauthorized improvement constructed on trust land became the property of the lawful landowner. That meant every foundation, every roof, every inch of asphalt belonged to me unless a settlement was reached. The room grew quieter after that. The title company representative leaned forward and asked what resolution I was seeking. Not demolition, not eviction. I told them I was not interested in tearing down homes or uprooting families. I was interested in recognition and compensation proportionate to 96 finished residences built without consent. The number Daniel presented was not emotional. It was calculated based on current market value per lot, multiplied across the subdivision footprint. When the figure was spoken aloud, even the rain seemed to pause between drops. Maggie's hands tightened around her pen. The developer's attorney requested a private caucus. They stepped out into the hallway, voices muffled behind a closed door. I remained seated, fingers resting on the leather folder that had once sat in my grandfather's desk drawer. For months, I had watched sprinklers mist over what used to be pasture. Now I was watching professionals recalibrate their understanding of leverage. Timing had done its work. The illusion of permanence had made the stakes too large to ignore. And in that quiet room, with nothing but documents and market valuations on the table, the balance of power shifted without anyone raising their voice. They came back into the room 43 minutes later with the kind of expressions people wear when the math finally settles in. The developer's attorney cleared his throat and spoke first, careful and measured, proposing a structured settlement that would convert the underlying land into a paid acquisition rather than a contested occupation. The title company would fund the majority. The developer would contribute the remainder. In exchange, I would execute a voluntary conveyance of the 72 acres into a new entity created to preserve the homeowner's titles moving forward. Daniel did not respond immediately. He adjusted his glasses and asked for the written numbers. When the document slid across the table, I scanned it once, then again more slowly. The figure was substantial, higher than what raw farmland would ever command, reflective of 96 finished residences and the risk of a full trial verdict. It accounted for market appreciation, legal exposure, and reputational damage. Maggie sat very still while the attorneys spoke around her. The rain had stopped, and thin sunlight filtered through the blinds, catching the edge of her pearl necklace. She finally met my eyes and asked, almost quietly, whether I had always intended to wait until the subdivision was complete. I told her I intended to rely on recorded law. Timing was theirs. Documentation was mine. There was no anger in my voice, just fact. We requested a short recess to review terms privately. Daniel and I stepped into the hallway where the air conditioning hummed and the faint scent of disinfectant lingered. He laid out the implications clearly. If we rejected the offer and went to trial, the court could affirm full ownership in my favor, but the path would be longer, more public, and more uncertain for families already living there. If we accepted, the land would be sold at a premium, the trust satisfied, and the subdivision legally stabilized. My grandfather believed in keeping promises, but he also believed in protecting what was his with clear eyes. I pictured him standing at the old fence line, hat pulled low against the sun, measuring twice before cutting once. After a few minutes, I nodded. When we returned to the conference room, Daniel outlined minor adjustments to payment schedule and indemnification language. The title company agreed. The developer agreed. Maggie did not speak again until the final draft was printed and placed before me. The pen felt heavier than it should have when I signed, ink settling into fiber that would close a chapter stretching back to 1962. With that signature, the land officially transferred under compensated terms, and 96 homeowners kept their houses without a cloud over their deeds. The trust was dissolved lawfully, not ignored. As we gathered our papers, the room felt different, lighter in a way. That comes when uncertainty finally collapses into resolution. Outside, the pavement still glistened from rain, and down the road in that neat row of houses, porch lights flicked on as evening settled. The illusion of permanence had been tested by paper, and paper had won. Not loudly, not dramatically, just inevitably. The wire transfer cleared 3 business days later, and I remember standing in my grandfather's kitchen when the notification came through, the soft chime of my phone echoing against tile that had not been replaced since 1978. The number on the screen was larger than anything my family had ever associated with that land, and for a moment I just stared at it while the refrigerator hummed and late afternoon light spilled across the counter. Money does not replace history. It does not recreate the feel of red clay under your boots or the sound of wind cutting across open pasture. But it does close a ledger. I drove out to the subdivision that evening, not to make a statement, not to linger, just to see it one more time through clear eyes. The entrance sign still stood in polished stone. The streetlights flicked on in quiet sequence as the sun dipped behind the trees. Children rode bicycles in slow circles on smooth asphalt that used to be uneven ground. Life had settled in quickly. Holloway Meadows no longer felt like an invasion. It felt like a fact. Maggie was near the clubhouse again, though without a microphone this time. She noticed me and hesitated before walking over. There was no hostility in her expression now, only a measured acknowledgement of what had transpired. She thanked me for choosing settlement over litigation. I told her I chose resolution over spectacle. The trust had been honored. The law had been respected. And the families living there would not wake up one day to a court order disrupting their homes. We stood in silence for a few seconds, the scent of freshly cut grass drifting through the air, sprinklers ticking softly in the distance. She admitted she had relied too heavily on county approval and developer assurances. I told her approvals are not ownership and enthusiasm is not title. The difference matters. As I walked back toward my truck, I paused at the old oak stump that still marked the original boundary line. It was now tucked behind a privacy fence between 2 backyards, almost hidden, but still there. I ran my hand across the rough surface and thought about how close this had come to being decided by noise and momentum instead of paper and patience. The 72 acres were no longer mine indeed, but they had not been taken. They had been sold under terms that acknowledged where they began. That distinction meant everything. On the drive home, dusk settling over Coal Ridge Road, I felt something steadier than victory. It was balance, the kind that comes when you do not rush to react, when you let overconfidence build its own weight, and when you step forward only after the foundation is complete. 96 houses stood where cattle once grazed, and families would build their own memories there. My grandfather's name would not be carved into a street sign, but it was embedded in every document that forced the truth into daylight. Justice did not arrive with raised voices or headlines. It arrived in recorded instruments, verified transfers, and a signature placed at exactly the right time. The weeks after the settlement felt quieter than I expected, almost ordinary, and that surprised me more than anything else. There were no headlines, no dramatic announcements, just recorded documents updated at the county clerk's office and a new deed transferring the land into the development entity under compensated terms. I went down there in person to watch the final filing, the faint smell of toner and aging paper hanging in the air while the clerk stamped the instrument with a firm, deliberate press. The sound of that stamp carried a kind of finality, decades of ownership condensed into a single impression of ink. When I stepped back outside, the Tennessee heat wrapped around me, thick and steady, and for the first time since I saw those first concrete slabs poured, I felt completely untethered from the outcome. Not detached, just settled. Over the next month, I redirected the funds into a mix of investments and a conservation parcel about 30 miles east, rolling land with a creek running through it, and no subdivision sign in sight. I did not buy it to replace what was lost. I bought it because land, when respected, still means something. Daniel called occasionally to update me on the final indemnification confirmations, making sure every clause we negotiated was executed cleanly. The title company moved quickly, eager to close the chapter without further exposure. Maggie resigned from her position as president of the association not long after the settlement finalized. I heard it through a neighbor who had known my family for years. There was no public scandal, no spectacle. Just a brief notice about leadership transition and a renewed focus on community transparency. I drove past the subdivision one last time before shifting my attention fully to new projects. The houses looked lived in now, porch swings gently rocking, garden beds edged with fresh mulch, basketball hoops anchored at the ends of driveways. The place no longer felt like a legal battleground. It felt like a neighborhood. I slowed near the entrance and noticed they had added a small plaque near the clubhouse that read established 2023, honoring the development year without naming anyone. That was fine. Legacy does not always need signage. It needs documentation. As I turned onto Coal Ridge Road, the asphalt smoothing out beneath my tires, I thought about how easily momentum can masquerade as legitimacy. 96 foundations, miles of wiring and plumbing, thousands of square feet of drywall and shingles, all built on the assumption that no one would look closely enough at the paperwork. They built confidence in stages. I built certainty in silence. The difference was not volume. It was patience. And patience, when paired with original ink and recorded trust language, outlasts optimism every time. The new parcel I bought sits on a gentle rise about 30 miles east, and the first morning I walked it alone. The air carried that clean scent of wet grass and cedar that reminds you the world is still bigger than paperwork. A narrow creek runs along the back edge, clear water sliding over smooth stones, steady and unbothered. There are no survey stakes hammered in by strangers, no banners stretched between temporary poles, just fence posts leaning slightly with age and a sky that feels wide enough to breathe under. I keep a copy of my grandfather's original deed framed in my office now, not because I need proof anymore, but because I need the reminder. Ownership is not loud. It does not arrive with microphones or applause. It sits quietly in drawers for decades, waiting for someone patient enough to read it line by line. A few months after everything closed, I received a letter forwarded from the association in the subdivision. It was from a couple who moved into one of the middle lots. They thanked me for choosing settlement over a drawn-out court fight, said they had heard fragments of the story through neighbors and legal notices, and that they were relieved their children could stay in the same school without uncertainty hanging over them. I read that letter twice, then folded it back into the envelope and placed it inside the same leather folder that once held the trust agreement. Not every victory needs to leave someone displaced to feel complete. Sometimes the stronger move is the one that protects what matters while correcting what went wrong. I still drive Coal Ridge Road now and then. The entrance stone remains polished. The lawns are thicker, trees planted along sidewalks starting to stretch upward. You would never know, looking at it from the outside, how close it came to being decided by assumption instead of record. Maggie moved out of her house that winter. I heard she took a listing job in another county, somewhere with fewer rural parcels and less complicated title history. I do not wish her harm. I wish her better research. When I stand on my new land at dusk, boots pressing into soil that has not been regraded or subdivided, I think about that first day in the courtroom, the weight of 96 households behind me and one leather folder in my hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I waited. The truth was always there, pressed into paper with a county seal from 1962, written in language that does not bend for optimism or convenience. They built houses. I built certainty. And in the end, certainty outlasted everything else.